next laureate is an architect who decided to abandon quite late in her career, or quite early on, I should say, decided to abandon computer science and take on architecture, her passion to develop those skills and to put it to good use towards her community back home in Niger with a young, vibrant, and expanding population. Her work is deeply rooted in the country's local and pre-colonial traditions, and her designs for public spaces have given women in her native Niger, a predominantly Muslim country, more freedom of gathering and movement. Her name is Mariam Kamara, and she is being honored for her outstanding talent in devising beautiful, imaginative, aesthetically relevant, and practical designs, for prioritizing human needs, and for innovative solutions that balance local requirements and cultural values. She's also being honored for demonstrating the social impact of architecture and designing buildings and spaces that are more democratic and socially and economically empowering. And she's also being honored for her significant contribution to contemporary thinking about modernity in Africa. Please welcome Mariam Kamara.
Good evening. Thank you so much for coming today. It's such an honor to just have the opportunity to speak in front of you today. And I would really like to thank the Prince Claus Fund. And maybe I'll have the chance to thank them even more tomorrow, but I'm just still so overwhelmed, I guess. It's been just the most surreal experience so far. Thank you. I always like to start by showing everyone where Niger is, because I know nobody knows. And I don't, hold it against you. It's normal. But I like to show it because Niger is in such a particular spot in Africa. Because it's in the middle in the way that you see, and it's really more of a desert country, it means that it also is not, this what you imagine stereotypically as being Africa, which tends to be, kind of like more tropical, or something like that. Climatically, it has more in common with Morocco, for example, or Algeria than it does, with Nigeria right below it. And it also means that it's kind of conditions that, look a certain way, perform a certain way, a climate that is very harsh. And because of that, I always considered myself really lucky that I grew up in the desert, actually, in this town. And it's basically the most powerful aspect of what made me as an architect. As was said earlier, I used to be a computer scientist, but I always wanted to be an architect. I didn't think that it was reasonable to do, because I was coming from an African country. It seemed that you should do something more lucrative. And especially if you had the privilege to be able to go study, thousands of miles away, you should put it to good use, economically speaking. But I became an architect out of a sense of humiliation. I felt a sense of humiliation because I grew up in a place where I felt in harmony with my environment in this town. I have these memories of coming back home to our house, and immediately, it was just nice and cool inside, and there was just the right amount of shade and all of those different things. I found out later on that it was because it was made out of earth, and that it has certain qualities that actually really were helpful in a desert climate, that kept the inside cooler, that really had a certain kind of feel, even a smell, that really you felt in harmony with. And then when I grew up, a little bit later, we moved to the capital, and then I was confronted with a completely different, experience that, again, I was too young to understand what it was back then. But really what it was that, we lived in a house where it was made like a Western house, where there was a living room, a dining room, 3 bedrooms, your typical middle-class environment. But all of a sudden, nothing was working, meaning that my parents would be, entertaining, but there would be nowhere to put us, and there would be all kinds of weird things that we had to do to get around the way the home worked, which just never seemed to make sense to me. Until, much later on, I realized that actually I live in a city that was built during colonization. And it was a city that was made for control It was a city that was built to be divided into, with one side being the indigenous side of the city, the other side being kind of, the European side. And after colonization, the European side was taken over by the political and economic elite of the country, which means that even today, you still have kind of this divide that is embedded, this inequality that's embedded in the city. But most importantly, it's a city that I always feel, wants to look a certain way, meaning that in the name of modernity, you want to emulate certain things. You want to look as Western as possible. The streets have to be perfect. You have to have these perfect sidewalks and, all of these things. But people, again, keep finding ways to get around it and use it differently, which irritates everybody and into thinking, well, no, this is not civilized, somehow, or whatever. But that's essentially what we do. And we do probably because it would be, living in the condition, like let's say, you're Amsterdam, the way it is, the beauty of it, the architecture of it, all of these things that work perfectly with its natural surrounding, with the water around and all of that. And you were told that, actually, this is completely wrong. This is not the way you should be living. This is not the way you should be building. This is not how your home should look, and they should look like this instead, because this is the idea of modernization. This is why I always felt humiliated, because essentially it's saying that everything that you represent, you have to dispossess yourself from. And there's something fundamentally wrong with it, and there's something fundamentally somehow uncivilized about it, and you should look like this. And so when I started working, I was really, taken by all these emotions, all these feelings are really what is the driving force behind the work that we do. And I'm lucky to live in a city where the architecture that came before colonization is still very much present. And it allows us to actually really work with people very closely, looking at materials, looking at the different issues that they have, be them economic. For example, this is a market that we designed in a really, really remote in a really remote village in Niger, where people only had market once a week. And it was just kind of this temporary thing that meant that the village actually doesn't have an economy. And so we proposed in its place a daily market that would be able to have the double capacity of what their budget that they had initially, but within the same budget. So thinking about the economic constraints around it, thinking about how do we live in our homes exactly, how do we entertain? We have this notion of public-private, but that is like part of the house. How do we integrate that into the architecture? How do we use materials that really make sense, but usher them in the 21st century? So maybe we don't use Adobe bricks anymore, and we use things that are more mechanical, but that still use materials that go along with the environment of the place. How do we use our designs to create ventilation, to decrease energy consumption, which goes a long way towards the economic reality of people? How do we create public spaces that really or public buildings that really are open to everyone and that provide spaces where people didn't used to intersect, or for example, women didn't necessarily have their place because there was just one room for, that men ended up taking over. How do we provide all the flexibility required so that they can both educate themselves and go pray and, and whatever else they might possibly need? How do you really just, think about these places where people feel welcome and they really feel like this belongs to them, but that also looks like them, but without necessarily feeling like you're just copying something that happened 100 years ago? And so it ended up becoming kind of this situation where now I feel very fortunate. It came from a place of a bit of negativity in a way, to actually really feeling privileged to live in an environment, to work and practice in an environment where actually we get to tackle a lot of issues that really are global issues. We get to tackle things that have to do with, the environment in a much more pressing way, which then actually could even be an example for places like here later, in terms of, well, what do you do, for energy consumption, as I was saying earlier? How do you start designing buildings that work in multiple different ways as a, kind of like incorporated system? The building can do shading outside, it can harvest water, it can ventilate inside, it can grow crops, on the top, for example. But really, how do you create real civic spaces where people feel welcome and included, where they don't have to feel, no matter where they live, whether it's in Niger, whether it's in Sao Paulo, whether it's, wherever, that you really feel like this is something that has something to do with you somehow. It's not about someone else's glory to themselves. Thank you.
Mariam Kamara, félicitations. Congratulations. Mariam, one of the things that you said that struck me was the fact that, as you say, many African countries were built during the era of European colonization, and therefore they're based on someone else's conception of what a city should look like. That may be true, but of course, what is also true are the architectural traditions within Africa based on vernacular architecture, using local materials and know-how. Traditions, but also marvels when you think of cities like Timbuktu in nearby Mali. To what extent do these sort of buildings inspire you as an architect who also lives around a lot of glass and steel buildings in the United States, where you also spend some of your time?
Well, it's super refreshing to begin with. No, they inspire me deeply because, historically, actually, the regions like Timbuktu were part of the same empire that some regions that are currently in Niger. So we actually have a lot of that architecture in our own country. So it just makes it very easy that I don't even have to work that hard, to find it or to be inspired by it. And it's kind of wonderful to be able to have these examples and then really be able to then try to project in the future, being really aware of, a contemporary setting, but, and not trying to negate the legacy of colonization. It is part of us now, and we have to compose with that as well.
And as a woman, how difficult is it for you to make your mark in what is also a largely male-dominated environment, architecture? You chose computer science and architecture. I don't know which one is more male-dominated than the other.
I think computer science is worse, actually.
But what do you, as a woman, what does a woman architect bring to the drawing table that a man might not?
I think it's like in every situation where you're not the norm or you're not the part of the majority, whether it's because of your gender, your color, whatever it is, that somehow makes you different, I believe ends up making you valuable because it provides an additional voice no matter what, because you come from a completely different experience, so you have something additional, the layers that you can add to the situation. So I always look at it as an advantage, actually.
An advantage indeed. And just speaking to you yesterday when we first met, you told me that you were taken by complete surprise when you got that phone call in July to tell you that,
I'm still surprised.
You're winning an award this evening. What is it, do you think, that so appealed to the awards committee that makes them see in you someone who has really made a social impact through her work?
Maybe it's for the committee to say. I think I'm much too focused on the work. So it's not really something that I think about that much, which is why it came as such a shock, For me, in a way, I feel possessed by the work that I do, by kind of the way in which that I practice, and all my energy is really, geared towards that. I'm unbelievably honored that they so value in that, and they so value in kind of this approach and this way of looking at things and practicing architecture.
And just finally, in the last few seconds that we've got, when you look at the universality of design, the fact that today we can travel from one city to the other and feel like we don't know where we are.
Yes.
Everything looks the same.
Isn't it sad?
How does individuality fit in all of this, in this digital age?
Well, I mean, it's like, of course there's a common human experience, right? So it's not to say that we're just so fundamentally different from each other. We're not. We're much more similar than we are different. But the thing is, we have these little things, that come from history, that come from climate, that come from geography, that made us make different choices, and they created a different kind of environment. So it's kind of surprising that we seem so hell-bent on making everything the same when nothing around us is really the same.
Yeah. Thank God for our differences in many respects.
Exactly.
Mariam Kamara, congratulations, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.